Tonight we're in the heart of London town. Welcome to Question Time. And good evening to you at home, good evening to our audience here, and to our panel, Labour's former Home Secretary, Alan Johnson, the Conservative Health Minister, Anna Soubry, one of the rising stars of UKIP, Diane James, the Political Director of Huffington Post UK, Mehdi Hasan, and the Tory peer and creator of Downton Abbey, Julian. Thanks very much. And our first question, Michael Kerr, please.
Following the slaughter of Lee Rigby, should Britain adopt a Big Brother approach to the surveillance of all forms of communication?
The proposal that there should be much more surveillance of all forms of communication following Lee Rigby's murder. Alan Johnson.
Well, I don't regard it as a Big Brother approach, but if what the question is inferring is should we adopt the communications data bill, I think we should. So did the government in last year's Queen's speech, because it was in there. Then there was a very important and I think very constructive contribution by a joint committee of both houses, Commons and Lords, because the bill was published in draft form. They pointed to a number of problems. They said the bill was too widely drawn, but they said that it still needed legislation. The Intelligence and Security Committee, which are the members of the House of Parliament of the Houses of Parliament, from both sides and from all sides, chaired by Malcolm Rifkin, they see all the MI6 and MI5 intelligence.
Before you go any further,
and they reported to the Prime Minister that there was a problem, that it was getting worse, and it needed to be tackled through legislation.
What exactly is it you would like to see, just to get to the heart of it?
Number one, it's not the content of communications. When people communicate by landline or mobile, the security services have always been able to look at who was ringing who, at what time, the duration of the call. Nothing to do with the content. That's a completely different system that has not been changed at all. But as new technology has advanced, there's new forms of technology and communication that are not covered by that legislation. And everyone who looked at this, me, my successor, Theresa May, the Intelligence and Security Committee, and even the Joint Committee of both houses said this is a problem and it does need to be addressed. It's disappeared from the Queen's speech, it seems, because the Liberal Democrats have vetoed it, having approved it being in the Queen's speech last year. Now, it's nothing to do with Woolwich, incidentally. This would still be an issue with or without Woolwich. It's hardly a knee-jerk reaction. This has been known for 6 years that there's a flaw in the intelligence services' ability to track these very necessary intelligence. Final point, I say 95% of all the cases that the security services have cracked, you know, 7 people due to take off in bombs, in planes to America, all these other plots that have been uncovered, 95% of them were uncovered through this very form of tracking who was involved, who was ringing who, the duration of the calls, not the content. This is nothing to do with the content.
And you said that Theresa May ought to resign if she doesn't get this through, which is a pretty tough stance to take.
Theresa, as always, but look, she's the Home Secretary. It's her prime responsibility with the Prime Minister to keep the public safe. She sees the need for this. We hear, behind the scenes, she argued for it on Sunday. I think it is so crucial to a Home Secretary's role that it is a resignation issue. And if I was the Home Secretary and I couldn't get this legislation through Cabinet and couldn't convince them as the voice of the security services and the police in these circumstances, then I wouldn't be able to do my job as Home Secretary.
But Alan, when you were Home Secretary, you didn't do it. And there must be a good reason why you didn't do it.
Yes, there is. There's a very good reason why we didn't do it, because I was Home Secretary in 2009 and there was an election in 2010. And the way the government have actually approached this is absolutely the right way. Publish a bill in draft before, give a year for various committees to look at it, take a very measured approach. We didn't have time to do that before the 2010 election.
Or you would have resigned if you hadn't been able to get it through.
Yes, yes.
Is Ed Miliband in favour of it?
Yes. Well, Ed Miliband agrees with the amendments.
You just said.
Agrees with the amendments that were made by the Joint Committee, which are very important. They were supposed to be in the legislation we saw in the Queen's speech. It's disappeared.
Anna Soubry.
Yeah, I mean, there is this loophole I mean, I used to be, before I got elected, I was a criminal barrister, so I'm aware of what we can do and the real evidential benefit that there is in looking at, for example, as Alan rightly describes, contact between people on mobile phones. The daft madness of it all is that you can't get the same sort of evidence on the basis of people using the internet to communicate with each other. And as he says quite rightly, it's not about the content, it's about the communication, it's about the timing, the fact that different people, and they literally, the intelligence forces, the police, put it together in a grid, and it's extremely useful evidence to show, especially conspiracy or joint enterprise.
And you'd like to see this go through?
And I would like to see it done. And I think that now is the time for all the political parties, because this should not be a party political issue, for us to sit down and work out a way that we can essentially tie up and secure this loophole so we can get what we want without the legitimate concerns that people have about any encroachment of Big Brother or the state in getting snooping.
Had you thought of ignoring the Liberal Democrats and going along with Labour, and the two of you would then have a big majority who could do it?
I don't think that we should start to try and see this as damaging the coalition and frankly playing cheap party political politics. It's
what would be the cheap? This is a national security issue.
Exactly.
What's cheap about it?
Well, no, but saying, oh, Labour and the Tories get together and gang up on the Liberals. That's not the approach to be taken in this at all. This needs us all to sit down, work out a way of achieving what I think we actually all want to achieve.
Right. Yes, sir.
Oh, yeah. If you put the bill aside for one moment, apparently Lee Rigby's killers were known to authorities for being activists. Shouldn't they have been under some sort of surveillance anyway, apart from the bill?
Mehdi Hasan.
I think it's a very good point the gentleman makes there about existing powers and existing surveillance techniques and existing flaws in the system. The very worst time to change your laws is in the immediate aftermath of what is a terrorist attack or an alleged terrorist attack. This is the worst time to panic, to have knee-jerk responses. And I was 100% with David Cameron on a rare occasion last week when he said that we should carry on with business as usual. We shouldn't have knee-jerk responses. And Alan is a great guy, a voice of reason on many issues. But on issues of counter-terrorism and civil liberties, the last person we should be taking advice from is a former Labour Home Secretary. That is the sad truth of the matter. The coalition, for all its faults, and whoever wants to take credit, the Tories or the Lib Dems who are not here tonight, has done a lot of good work in terms of restoring a lot of civil liberties that were lost under 13 years of Labour. And thank God for the Lib Dems standing up against this Snoopers Charter or this Big Brother move, whatever you want to label it. You know, the Lib Dems haven't exactly been people who stand up for much in recent years. Nick Clegg has been a kind of Mr. Blobby figure
but do you see this
standing up for things, but, you know, he's spot on this.
You think this is an encroachment of civil liberties? Why?
Mass surveillance, David, is either a surveillance. Well, it is. You're not going after any of it. But at the moment, everyone's emails. Let me finish my point. What happens in these situations is it's innocent people, it's ordinary people who get surveilled on, and the criminals and the terrorists actually find a loophole.
So you believe that the security forces, shouldn't have the ability to track phone calls over landlines and over mobile phones? I think that must be the obvious.
I think that a government that could not keep control of 25 million child benefit records on a single CD and lost it in the post should not be entrusted with the data of the entire population on spurious.
All government is negotiating the exchange of freedom for security.
Exactly.
And you give up certain freedoms in order that you may be free to walk home at night without being attacked, whatever it is. That's the whole basis of government. And in this instance, it does seem to me that already the existing situation, which is when they do have permission to go in, when they have some reason to suspect, all that is needed, I think, and I'm only speaking for one of the lobbies, is to loosen the rules that bind them. There's a thing, they can only hold information for 30 days. They can only do this for something or other. They can't repeat the request.
Use intercept evidence in court.
Exactly. If we had a situation within the existing laws whereby once they have a reason to investigate and interfere and actually look at the you know, whatever someone is doing on their computer or their telephone, whatever, but they're doing it unfettered and able to achieve a result, surely that is, apart from anything else, more realistic than trying to screen 60 million people. I mean, this is one of the things, is simply to make it easier for the investigative forces and to take away the current rules that restrict them. And that would make a big difference.
You, sir.
The communications bill, I mean, if adopted, it would only solve the symptom of the problem of terrorism. I mean, the source of terrorism really is extremism, and that has to come down to the aggressive British foreign policy. I mean, we had an attack in the US, the Boston bombings in France, and now the UK, and all of these had to do with the attackers saying they were upset, you know, with the Western foreign policy.
We'll come to that question in just a moment. Let me bring Diane James in on the first point about surveillance.
Okay, I think Julian makes some interesting points, but the one I would still come back to, how on earth are we going to resource this if this bill goes through? Mehdi's made the very good point that, you know, quite frankly, governments of every colour have got a lamentable record in terms of the way they've made or held the data in any form of security, the quality of the information, how that's been handled as such. My understanding is that MI5, MI6 have got a budget which is under considerable threat from the austerity measures that this coalition government is bringing in. So it's all very well to say, and I agree entirely with Mehdi's point, that, you know, this is a gross intrusion of generalised civil liberties with no necessity. There's a very small proportion of the population that does need monitoring. But if we're going to suddenly be embarking on this huge exercise, very costly, without the budget to do it, you know, quite frankly, it's going to fail at the first hurdle.
This is not surveillance. We have to get this absolutely clear. This is not surveillance. It's about the sort of access to data which we currently allow with mobile telephones and landlines, and we merely seek to extend that to the internet. It is not about surveillance.
Well, with all due respect,
let's just clarify. To clarify this, sorry, you're making a distinction. You're asking the ISPs to say we keep all track of all the things that have been done, but not the content of what's been done. That's the point.
It shows a trail, and so at the moment...
And then you can access that with the permission of the Home Secretary if you choose to.
Then you get into completely different territory, but this is about the ability to get data, which, just as you can at the moment, for mobile phones...
random murder in the street?
No, and that's why...
But it prevented a whole series of plots that you've read about, and the people have been tried.
It's not just about terrorism.
It's not.
Hold on, Alan, if we've already prevented lots of plots, why do we need new laws?
No, because it's not about terrorism. This is the other thing which we mistake. If you look at the way that we've collected data, for example, on mobile phones and landlines, it's been particularly successful in the prosecution, for example, of drug rings. And it's incredibly important evidence. I've seen it myself in court, as you may imagine. And so it's an extension of that, and it's really about just filling in this loophole. It's not surveillance and it's not snooping.
There are a number of people with their hands up. If you want to talk specifically about the surveillance issue, do. Otherwise, we'll widen it out to the question that was put over here with a question from Edward Poole. Edward Poole, please.
Would we see fewer terrorist attacks in this country if we didn't invade or support the invasion of other countries?
I don't know whether this particular Woolwich attack would this count as one of the examples you're talking about?
That sort of thing, yeah.
Yes. Mehdi Hasan.
The short answer is, I think, yes. And I'm glad the questioner put this question. In fact, I've just written an article on it today on this very subject. I don't think foreign policy is the only factor in terms of motivating people, in terms of radicalising people. To pretend it isn't a factor, to pretend it's got nothing to do with it, as Boris Johnson and even David Cameron, I think, was suggesting last week, that we shouldn't draw any link, I think is mad. If you look at all of the people who've been captured in failed terrorist attacks or captured after terrorist attacks, or looked at the videos of these people, they all say the same thing. They all talk about invasions and occupations and support for dictators and support for occupations. And I think at some stage you have to ask the question, you know, are we going to take seriously what these people are saying? Are we going to... That doesn't mean you change your foreign policy on the basis of what terrorists demand. That doesn't mean they're justified in carrying out gross and barbaric acts of violence. Not at all. But it does mean if you want to take a multifaceted, multi-pronged approach to preventing radicalisation, you have to put foreign policy in that mix. It can't just be other issues and not our disastrous foreign policy. The former head of MI5, David, said that I warned the government that if we invade Iraq, it will spur young British Muslims towards terror. It will radicalise young men. And now, when you say that, you're accused of being some kind of mad lefty or some extreme anarchist, when the former head of MI5 and various intelligence agencies all warned us what our foreign policy would produce. And it has produced, sadly.
Okay. Thank you. I'll come to you. Just a word of warning. This is now, of course, the Woolwich case is sub judice because the one person has been charged, so we must keep off that. But the general point, you, sir.
My point is with regard to the total communication gap which exists between the community leaders and the politicians and the agencies which are responsible for this. Because I can see, for instance, that the community leaders have not played the role which they were expected to play. And I think there is a serious crisis there. They have to win the confidence of the community they are living in and to pass on their aspirations, their ideas to the politicians and to the people, public in general, so that they should know what they're thinking and what their feelings are about.
Okay. Anna Soubry.
I think it's right and fair to say that we often see, and history has shown us this, that when you have disaffected, often young people, they may be angry, they may have other troubles in their lives, that they fall prey often to this radicalisation, to extremism, and it can go to all sorts of appalling levels. And so I think that when we look at, and we do have to be careful because somebody has been charged, and so we're in difficult legal territory. But it's an important matter, this, because we know that too many, usually males, in our Muslim community in particular, have been radicalised in this way, and it has caused much upset and anger in the Muslim community because the vast majority of that faith are decent, law-abiding, honest, good people. And I just feel this with some passion, having seen two members of my constituency today who happen to be Muslims. They came to lobby me about my views on the plain packaging of cigarettes, actually. But I thought that this was a story worth repeating, that at the end of our very interesting discussion, they said they actually felt the need to apologise to me in some way because of their faith, and to make the point to me that not all Muslims were like some that we have seen in recent events. And I interrupted them to say, you don't have to apologise at all for your faith, because good, sensible people in this country know exactly the overwhelming majority of people of your faith are good, decent citizens, and we are proud to have you in our country.
Don't we get stuck going down a rabbit hole when we only talk about extremism? Isn't it more of a sense of a lack of belonging for young men? And it's a wider sense. The same thing that draws somebody towards Islamic radicalism, it's the same issue as draws someone towards gangs or draws someone towards the EDL or other violent groups. Isn't it more a sense we have to look at a core issue of young men feeling disenfranchised somewhat and feeling a lack of belonging, and we do have a wider issue rather than get stuck down the singular focus of Islamic radicalism.
Alan Johnson, I'd like to bring you back to Mr. Poole's question, was would we see fewer terrorist attacks here if we didn't invade or support invasion of other countries? That was the question.
Well, 9/11 happened before any country was invaded. There would still be jihadists around, I believe, with or without what happened. And in terms of Kosovo, of course, we went in to defend Muslims who were being butchered. And I think the argument there is we probably should have gone in earlier. So there will always be people who want to make that link, yes, of course, and you can't divorce it from foreign policy. I agree with Mehdi on that. Foreign policy has to be part of the mix, but this kind of suggestion that this is all because of, usually about the invasion of Iraq, I don't think that's the case at all. In fact, you could make a very good case for looking at the Middle East if Saddam was still there, if you want to draw those kind of what-if questions, and finding a very difficult situation in the Middle East, as we're finding in Syria.
Alan, I do enjoy the kind of selective quoting of intelligence. On the last question, you told us the intelligence agencies need to be listened to, they need these powers to prevent plots. In 2003, the Joint Intelligence Committee told your government that if we invade Iraq, we will heighten the threat to the UK from Al-Qaeda. And today you say, well, actually, no, it's not to do with Iraq, even though your own intelligence agencies told you it was to do with Iraq.
The point I made was 9/11 was nothing to do with the invasion of any country. That was an attack on America.
It was an attack on America, but are you saying before 9/11, you airbrush people out of history? The Palestinians have been occupied for decades. The West was supporting the Saudi dictatorships. There were sanctions on Iraq for decades. So you can't just start the clock on 9/11 and forget 50 years of unjust, oppressive Western foreign policy in the Middle East.
I want to bring in Edward Poole, who asked the question.
I have to say Alan Johnson hit the nail on the head precisely. Before 9/11, there was no question in our minds as a British nation of having an involvement with invading other countries. Our presence in other countries is as a result of what was even voiced by the man who's now standing accused of an awful crime last week. He said, or he's reported to have said, "I want to start a war on London streets tonight." We live in a surreal world. We've been at war for many years, and what we are doing is trying to protect our freedom and the safety of our nation. So the excuses given by radicals and terrorists is feeble.
Okay, that was Michael Kerr, by the way, who asked the first question. Julian Fellers.
Yes, for me the issue is not really that is terrorism the result of our intervention, because if we were absolutely sure that our intervention was the correct thing and terrorism was a byproduct of doing the right thing, then it would be a much clearer issue.
Agreed.
For me, I'm not sure what we think we are achieving with much of this invasion and involvement. I mean, we read today that Helmand Province is as disturbed and all the rest of it as it was when we arrived, and that's after, 2,000 for every man, woman and child in the country. I mean, I know it's not the money, but the truth is, if we are spending all this money, if we are seeing young men and women give their lives or be maimed or whatever, we've got to be sure we're achieving something. And my problem is that I think we would do more to go in with aid at the end when some kind of resolution has been reached, rather than this inevitable stoking up of the whole thing. I mean, we're at the moment on the edge of it in Syria, and we were told yesterday by our leaders that if we arm the rebels, it'll take people towards the peace table. Well, the next minute Russia comes in with their arms for the other side, and we're suddenly escalating, or potentially escalating, a kind of proxy war. It seems to me we're very amateurish in a way about all of this. We're dabbling in cultures we don't understand, and we are not getting the results that we think we're going to achieve. And the one thing all of these countries have in common is that the outsider who goes in to meddle is the bad guy. And that's just true across the board, and we seem not to be able to take that on board.
The woman in the second row there.
I have to disagree with Mr. Hasan, actually. He's saying that this radicalisation and these thoughts have existed for decades. However, what sticks out in my mind, and I'm 27, is 9/11. And a lot of the people who are actually going out and becoming radicalised, being extremists, look at the gentleman last week, he's of my age, of my generation. So this has all happened since then, and that's what you need to target. It's not been happening. Yes, it's been happening for decades, but a lot of people have become aware about it only since 9/11.
Oh, I agree with you. I was responding to Alan's point that 9/11 came out of the blue. It didn't come out of the blue. Obviously, what's happening now is a product of our wars abroad, and that's what all of the terrorism experts say. All the studies show, all of the intelligence agencies around the world say. It's not a controversial point.
Diane James.
Key question, yes, I think there is a direct correlation, and the number of statements we've heard from young people who have turned to radicalism and extremism, what they are citing is, quite frankly, they want revenge and they want retaliation. Now, fundamentally, we've made some very bad decisions, I believe, over the last few years. We've followed the US, or we've been asked by the US to go into scenarios, war situations around the world with no good evidence, and the weapons for mass destruction was one of the clearest misleading statements to get us into that particular conflict. Syria could be the next one. we've got no justification, we've got no jurisdiction, and we've got no interest. And every single time we follow what I believe is absolutely misguided policy, we are going to fuel young people who, listening to individuals who actually should be deported, and it's as simple as that. There should be none of this, allowing them to stay here and still radicalise people on the streets. We are just going to continue with a problem.
Yusuf, and then I'm going to go to the Syria point. Yes, Yusuf.
I can't allow one of Mehdi Hasan's comments to go unchallenged. He said, I speak as somebody whose father fought at Monte Cassino in General Anders' army. He said the Palestinians have been occupied for, I can't remember the period of time he said, but a long time.
46 years according to international law.
I'm old enough to remember 1956. I'm old enough to remember 1967. I'm old enough to remember 1973. I don't know who the aggressors were, but that is a totally unjustified comment. The State of Israel exists through the decision of the United Nations. And this radicalisation by our going into other countries might be a fact, but we have to do what is right. We got rid of a dictator in Iraq, Saddam Hussein. The situation there might be wrong now, but we got rid of a dictator. If we do the same in Syria, we risk doing the same thing. The opposition there are just as radical as Assad, are just as bad. However, we can't sit back and do nothing. We have to follow our beliefs.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to Syria, because we're talking about serious issues here, and we've got a question on Syria. I think we might as well take it at the same time. But just before we do, a reminder that you can, of course, at home take part in this debate, either by using our hashtag on Twitter, which is BBCQT, or follow us at BBC Question Time, or text us if you prefer to 83981, and the red button will tell you what others are saying. But let's carry on this debate with Chris Clark. Please, Mr. Clark.
Is arming the Syrian rebels in our national interest?
Is arming the Syrian rebels in our national interest? We know that the EU lifted the ban on providing arms this week. Julian Fellows.
Well, we've started on this, really. I mean, they have lifted the ban, and Mr. Hague suggests that it'll take them, accelerate them towards the peace table. To know this is a possibility. I personally think Russia's joining in with the offer of other weapons rather make it clear that the danger is that we will be living this kind of proxy war. I mean, it's a very frightening prospect to me. Of course I understand that the President Assad is ghastly. I don't have any problem with that. And I hope he falls very soon. But, I'm not keen on what the Chinese are doing in Tibet. Should we get in there? And maybe when we've finished in Beijing, let's push off to Moscow and sort out Putin. I mean, where does it end? And one has to somehow keep a grip on areas where we do have a kind of responsibility. I suppose I do feel that. Sometimes there is a kind of historic responsibility to get in. But I think that kind of reckless, just being the kind of policeman of the world, we can't afford it. But anyway, I don't think anyone can. So for me, it seems dangerous. I mean, Mr. Hague says we won't have any troops on the ground. Well, yes, we will, because people will have to explain how to work the weapons that we're sending. He tells us it'll go to the good rebels as opposed to the bad rebels. Well, I mean, yes, dear. These things are impossible. And I have a slight, just a qualifying admiration. Once again, I do rather admire Mr. Hague and Mr. Cameron for going with something that God knows would not be popular, and certainly would not be a question of governing for votes. And I sort of like that in them. But I think in this instance, there's nothing for us there until at the end, when we can go in with aid and help the new post-Assad state get settled and set up.
Okay. You sat up the back there with spectacles.
I'm finding the real problem is not so much arming the rebels, it's what happens, very similar to the Americans in the Bay of Pigs. Arming the rebels is all well and good, but when it doesn't work out, what does the state do? That's the dangerous line that I find. If it doesn't work out arming the rebels, where does the state come in? That's
Alan Johnson, what's your view of this?
The rebels are already armed. Syria is awash with weapons. And the decision that was made this week wasn't about other countries in Europe making this decision, it was about Britain making the decision. It required unanimity to keep the sanctions, because the decision had run out after 2 years. The sanctions and the arms embargo were taken together. The rest of Europe, France was in quite an equivocal position actually, but the rest of Europe knew that if they didn't go along with this, they wouldn't keep the sanctions because Hague would have vetoed it. So virtually he's on his own. The Americans are supposed to support arming the rebels, but there's no chance of Obama or America doing it themselves. So this is purely Britain. This is British arms that are going into a country that's awash with weapons. Julian's quite right. We don't know whether they're going to get to the good rebels, if you like, and there's plenty of evidence. Quite right. We don't know whether they're going to get to the good rebels, if you like, and there's plenty of evidence now that actually Assad does have a large proportion of the population on side, the Alawites for a start, from his particular sect. So I can't see how this will help the Syrian people. Leave aside, is it in the best interests of Britain? Is it in the best interests of Syria, where we want to see a peaceful solution? I mean, there's no options here that are good options. Yep. William Hague is faced with a whole series of options, none of which are perfect. But this seems to me to be absolutely the wrong thing to do, at exactly the wrong time. It's led to a reaction from Russia, and although the idea of peace talks is very tenuous, at least it was there for June, July, and this seems to have scuppered that as well.
And you think it's something that they're seriously considering doing, not just a matter of putting pressure by saying they might and bringing
Well,
Assad
William Hague has said this would
table.
put pressure on Assad. Well, I don't think it will. Not with Russians stepping in with the most sophisticated air missiles in the world.
Has it been a misjudgment,
No,
Anna Soubry?
not at all, because I think one of the things we have got to accept, and I think Alan's absolutely got this wrong, is the fact that this was us and the French particularly that wanted the embargo to be lifted, and quite rightly and properly so, because it then gives us the opportunity, should we so choose, to supply weaponry and armament to those people who are fighting against Assad. So we're not saying we're definitely going to do it, but
can you answer this question?
We're lifting the embargo so that we have that there. As
Second point then, Chris Clark's question, is arming the Syrian rebels in our national interest, in your opinion?
Well, I think sometimes, and it comes back to the point that the gentleman at the front here made, sometimes you have to do what you believe is the right thing. And Alan, in the previous answer, referred back to Kosovo. And there were other instances where we should have done things which we didn't do, and to our great regret.
And what's your view on this particular one?
On Syria?
Yes.
I think obviously what we want is we want a proper negotiated peaceful settlement. That is the way forward. And by the way, we are putting aid in because we know that millions upon millions of people are being displaced. Many more, tens and hundreds of thousands of people, innocent women and children in particular, are being slaughtered. There is good evidence that this man is using chemical weapons against his own people. And forgive me, but I don't think we should sit back on that. I think we have a right and a duty to say that this is not acceptable in the modern world.
To put Chris Clark's question to you, can I repeat it again? Is arming the rebels in our national interest?
Well, we haven't.
You haven't answered that.
Well, forgive me, we haven't got to that stage yet. We've lifted the embargo so that is an option that we have. And if we were to do it, as Hague has made absolutely clear, it would be done in a very cautious and sensible and responsible way. Look, it's a difficult situation. Nobody's going to pretend it isn't anything other than that, and it's hugely complicated as well in Syria.
But David, do you mind if I just make the point? I think William Hague appears to be the only individual in the United Kingdom at this point in time who thinks arming the rebels, whether it's a diplomatic ploy for a month or so, or whether it does actually deliver weapons, he must be the only individual who thinks that's going to resolve this or in any way help. I mean, I can almost imagine somebody saying, how are we going to tag these weapons to make sure that they're allocated to the right rebel? And who is going to be the right rebel? And when is that right rebel suddenly going to then start talking to somebody here in the UK and leading to more radicalisation here? It's just a ridiculous piece of policy.
Right. You, sir.
Arming the rebels in Syria is analogous to overthrowing Saddam and the war in Afghanistan. We'll go there, we'll arm them, they'll take over the government, and then in 20 years' time, when we're not happy with them, we'll have to kick them out again. It's absolutely ridiculous.
Mehdi Hasan.
They're sovereign.
There are no good options in Syria, that's true. I mean, there's an old saying that whoever fights monsters should see to it that they don't become monsters themselves in the process. And let's be very clear, Bashar al-Assad is a monster who I loathe. And incidentally, I loathed him when the US government was rendering terror suspects to Damascus to be tortured by Assad's secret police just a few years ago. And Assad's monstrous regime is responsible for much of the violence in Syria. The problem is the rebels fighting him, a lot of them have become monsters in their own right. The Syrian revolution began more than 2 years ago as a non-violent, idealistic Arab Spring-style protest against tyranny. It's since sadly morphed into something else. It's been hijacked by sectarian thugs, by ex-military men, by foreign jihadists, by gangsters. The UN, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, read the reports about what some of the rebels have done. Torture, beheadings, suicide bombings, the use of child soldiers. There have been claims that the rebels have also used chemical weapons. A few weeks ago, some of us watched a rebel commander, and not a foreign fanatic, a secular Syrian rebel commander, cut the heart out of a dead man and bite into it. And yet, a few weeks later, our Foreign Secretary pushes the rest of the EU into lifting an arms embargo so we can potentially supply arms to this man's allies. So we can supply arms to rebels who include Jabhat al-Nusra, a group which has openly pledged allegiance to Al-Qaeda. So let me get this straight. At home, we're fighting against extremism and countering radicalisation. Abroad, we're sending bombs and bullets to radicals and extremists, or we're planning to cover all of it. That isn't just double standards, that is insanity.
Man in the blue shirt in the second row from the back there.
I'd like to say I do support the arming of the rebels, and the reason I support it is because the reason Assad has been so successful in killing his own people is because of the support that he's had from Russia and China. And those are two powers that do not seem to worry how many people get killed if they're pursuing their own interests. And I think it's absolutely right for us to now start to draw a line in the sand and say that we're not accepting any more of this support and killing, that we will stand up and say that what is happening in Syria, supported by these powers, Russia and China, is wrong, and we are going to start to go on the side and try and reverse this process.
Okay. And I'll just go back to the questioner here.
Yeah, I'd like to say, first of all, surely arming the rebels is just fueling the fire. As you've mentioned, we don't know whether war material is going to go to. But I'd also say that previous interventions have failed. Look at Iraq, look at Afghanistan. We're going to leave them as well in a bigger mess, almost you could say, than we found them. But mainly, is it any of our business? Is it any of our business for the government to say, oh yes, we have a right to get involved? No, your job is to represent Britain and put our interests first. That's what I'd like to say.
And one last point from the woman there.
Is there a worry that this action may cause a bigger international war? That's my worry on this matter.
Alan Johnson?
Yes, absolutely. Look, I mean, they're talking about this tenuous, Kerry goes over to Russia, they talk about getting a peace conference, some diplomatic efforts underway. It's essential that Russia is round that table. It's essential that Iran is round that table. They're arming the Assad regime. It's essential that you get all the players round that table. And I think if we don't, by the actions that William Hague has taken, he does run the risk. I wouldn't say, I wouldn't accuse William of doing this in any way deliberately, but it does run the risk of escalating the whole arms race. And that means you are in a worse situation than you were before. It's all right saying put more arms in on the rebel side. Actually, there's plenty of countries arming the rebels, but what is our objective? Our objective is a peaceful solution. You don't get that by putting more weapons in and killing more Syrians.
Options open. That's what it's about. And that's power.
Let's leave that and come now back home. Clearly domestic issues. There's a question I have here from Katinka Ashrafi, please. Katinka Ashrafi.
Does the fact that patients are more likely to die on the weekends demonstrate that NHS's gradual deterioration?
This was the news of a survey which showed that you would best be operated on a Monday. You have a better chance of living than if you're operated on on a Friday. Anna Soubry, rather up your street.
Well, statistics show us facts, but they don't give us the explanations and the understanding behind the facts. And I thought it was very interesting that the NHS medical director, Sir Bruce Kehoe, who is a heart surgeon by training, explained that when he was operating as a heart surgeon, he would often have his most difficult, most risky patients put into his surgery on a Friday, quite deliberately, because he wasn't in surgery on a Saturday and a Sunday. Because of the weekend, people would therefore spend longer time in intensive care, and because he wasn't in surgery, he was therefore available and able to give them more attention over the weekend. So
why do more people die if operated on a Friday than a Monday? Because
if you are putting more of your risky patients in on a Friday, they run the risk, hence being risky, of them unfortunately not surviving that surgery. So it's not as simple as saying if you go in on a Friday you run a higher risk because there's some failing in the system, there's something wrong in the staff. It could be because you are in any event more at risk of not surviving from your operation, that you have been put there on a Friday specifically so that you can be given extra care. But there is another story involved in all of this, and I think it's something that Sir Bruce, as it happens, is looking at, and that is making the best use that we possibly can of our NHS so that it reflects the real lives that most of us live. And that is looking at whether or not we could do much better by having more parts of our hospitals open at the weekends. And if you've ever been in the unfortunate situation of going into, say, A&E on a Sunday night, and you may think that I may be speaking from experience here, and then you are admitted, but you can't have a scan because that part of the hospital isn't open until Monday, and so you wait in the bed on Sunday night until Monday comes along, and because there's such a backlog, you actually can't have your scan on a Monday, so they send you home. Now, if we had more sensible working arrangements, it could have a potentially much greater improvement in our NHS. So that's what this is all about.
Alan Johnson, do you agree with that analysis, that gradual deterioration is not the issue?
No, I do broadly. This was an analysis done by Dr. Foster at St Mary's Hospital, and what they were doing was looking at planned surgery, elective surgery. So this is not emergency care at all. This is people planning to go in and have hip replacements or etc. The mortality rate overall in that is something like 0.6%. It's tiny. It's tiny. And what they did is over 3 years they looked at the people who had died, that tiny proportion, and equated it with this issue about the weekend. And Anna's quite right. You know, this is not. I've got plenty of political issues with Anna and her government about the NHS, but this is not one of them, because really you will find that there are reasons why the patients who are having elective surgery, the ones who are least likely to come through, are operated on later in the week for the reason Anna said. And this mustn't be pumped up into yet another attack on the NHS, as if people are dying on the operating table in huge numbers at elective surgery. It's a tiny number, tiny number.
It seems that Anna was kind of alluding to potentially like a 7-day hospital with about scanning and having scans available on a Saturday and a Sunday, but one of the main problems with having more scanning facilities is that you need to put more money in. And with the current climate, is that possible?
Diane James.
Yes, thank you for the observation you've made. And I'm going to pick up on Alan's point, which was, he's got plenty of issues with the current coalition government's policy on the NHS. When this reform was launched, part of that reform was that the NHS had to find, before 2015, 20 billion of efficiency savings. Now, I don't know about you, but efficiency savings to me equals costs. And costs in the NHS means you actually start to reduce things. And one of the areas that was identified very, very early on, and the audit, I believe it was the Audit Commission costed this, was that 5 billion would be on staff alone. Now, when you take staff out of the system, they can't man the equipment, they can't be on the wards, they can't be there doing the surgery and whatever. So I do see, and I go back to the question which I very much welcome, this is a direct correlation. No, if you affect the NHS in that way, and supposedly ring-fence it when it's not being ring-fenced at all, you start to see problems. And the A&E issue is just one of them, and in the last few weeks we've had the non-emergency number, we've had others, and it just shows you that it's creaking.
Sorry,
seriously creaking.
Forgive me, but the £20 billion of savings,
efficiency savings.
Savings were actually introduced under the last government, which had cross-party agreement, and it's ways of making sure that the money that's in the NHS is better spent. So it's not, forgive me, but it's not about cuts. It's about making sure that you move money into the better areas and you spend that money more efficiently. And on staff, I have to say, there are more doctors than before, and the cuts that have been made in staff is to managers and bureaucrats, something I thought you would have approved.
No, it hasn't, because clinical commissioning groups have led to this. You know, you take out one element, you take out the strategic health authorities, you take out the primary care trusts, and you immediately launch into clinical commissioning groups. You put doctors into a situation where they're trying to deal with the bureaucracy, when quite frankly they ought to be treating
No, but
patients.
they're not. They are the people that are commissioning the services, which is why we are seeing such an improvement in commissioning, because we have trusted the health professionals to do it. And I have to say there are many, many examples of where it is working exceptionally well.
Well, I think you need to look
exceptionally well.
Well, I think you need to look at the clinical commissioning group.
I'm more
The
than happy to
central
share them with
truth
you.
of this is whether or not people die more at the weekend, and I don't know enough about it. We all have a better chance of surviving our operations and illnesses than we did before there was an NHS. And the fact is, the NHS is a marvellous element in life in this country. And what I don't understand, of course it's going through a kind of crisis. It has to deal with far more people. There are far more treatments available. Everything is more expensive, and so on and so on and so on. And of course it's very difficult to manage all that. But this is a real area for Anna's asking for a cross-party solution. We all want the same thing, which is an efficient NHS that runs well and all the rest of it. Surely this is one area where the political parties could put their differences to one side and work together as to what the NHS needs and the support it should get.
Julian, I'm not arguing against cross-party agreement, but when even the Royal Colleges don't support the reforms, when David Cameron had to call a pause in terms of the launch of the reform bill, then haven't you really got a problem? You can have cross-party support, but when you haven't got the mechanics joined up and believing in what's going on, then I believe you've got a problem.
Let me bring Mehdi Hasan in. Sorry, Mehdi.
I'm astonished to turn up to Question Time tonight and find myself agreeing with UKIP on pretty much every issue raised tonight. I am with Diane. I mean, you can't have a cross-party consensus when some of the things that are going on in the National Health Service are going on. I'm with Julian, great fan of the health service, but 2 points on costs. Number one, Labour put in a lot of money into the NHS and did improve quality under Alan and other health secretaries, no doubt about that. One of the problems, though, with the money they put in is a lot of that money was sucked up into salaries, specifically salaries of doctors, GPs and consultants. We have some of the highest paid doctors in the world. You look at any international league table, and I do think when it comes back to the weekend point, and I'm with Julian, I'm not an expert on the weekend figures, but there seems to be a case that if you've got weekend care, and those of us who've been into hospitals on the weekend, surely there should be a consultant covering hospitals at all times, given how much those consultants are paid. I don't see why we shouldn't expect consultant-led care at all times, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day in the NHS. I don't think that's a big ask. On the specific coalition point about costs and wonderful euphemism for cuts that is efficiency savings, £20 billion of efficiency savings in the NHS. At the same time, the coalition brings in this unnecessary, top-down, bureaucratic, private sector-friendly reorganisation which is supported by no profession working in the NHS, which costs us between £3 to £4 billion. So why are we spending £3 to £4 billion on a pointless reorganisation? Virgin care and the rest of it.
A couple of points for our audience. Woman up there at the back, and then I come to you in the dark blue shirt there. So, yes.
One of the issues being debated on the Conservative Policy Forum this week was to try and save money for the NHS by restricting access to GP and limiting the amount of times you can visit your general practitioner. How is that improving the NHS and improving the health of the nation?
It was one idea amongst many ideas, and I can assure you it is not my party's policy and it will never come to fruition.
Okay, and you, sir, briefly, if you would.
I was one of the bureaucrats that was made redundant from the NHS. And I know from a lot of the people that I worked with, a lot of people lost their jobs at the PCTs at massive public expense with sometimes huge redundancy packages. They're now all been hired back to work for the clinical commissioning groups doing pretty much exactly the same jobs they were doing before.
Have you been hired back?
I haven't, no. I work at a GP surgery now.
Right.
Can I come back on this point about
Very
CCG?
briefly, because I want to get another question.
I think we have to make it clear that Diane's party's policy is actually to have elected county health boards, and if there was ever a ridiculous idea on how to run our NHS, I think that was it. I mean, you can't have politicians micromanaging the commissioning of services. I would take issue with you, sir, about the success of CCGs, because the evidence is clearly emerging that they are proving to be extremely beneficial. We are seeing a different approach to commissioning in a way that we've not seen before.
And your public satisfaction in the NHS is falling.
No, because when you see how the commissioning is working, because it's led by the people at the sharp end, doctors and nurses and other health professionals are now controlling those services and having direct impact, and it is absolutely for the benefit of patients.
All right, Anna Soubry, you've made your point, and we'll come back to it, no doubt, in 6 months' time when we see how things are working out. I want to take a last question, and this is from Tamir Shammu, please.
Does the Commission's position on the UK's benefits policy mean it's finding time to get out of the EU?
This is today's report that the EU Commission is going to take the UK to court on its on what counts as residency in the United Kingdom before you can receive certain benefits. Does this mean it's finally time to get out of the EU? Cue Diane James.
Well, of course it is. I mean, you know... What,
well, it's a surprise you say that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure.
But, you know, what better example of the...
I'd have to agree with her.
Absolutely. Prime Minister claiming he's going to go to Brussels and he's going to repatriate powers and he's going to do this, that and the other. And there it is. It's almost as though he's been whacked around the cheeks with a wet fish and told to go back and do his homework. You know, it's not something that he's got a leg to stand on, quite frankly. Employment law, right of access for all EU residents, cross boundaries, it's there, it's enshrined in law.
Right.
And you've got equality, you can't fiddle with it. You either come out and start again and do your own thing, or you stay in and you stay in the party. And I think it was one of the European heads who said, UK always has this issue, it goes onto the playing field, think it's going to play a particular sport, and then it chooses a different sport and different rules. Well, we can't keep doing that.
So you're saying the Commission has got the British government banged to rights, and the British government will lose this case?
I believe it will.
Alan Johnson, do you believe that?
No, I don't believe that. In fact, it's been tested in the UK courts on several occasions, and UK courts have always come down to say that this does not breach EU law. Now, I agree. The Commission, someone in the Commission is a UKIP member, because they're certainly trying to help them at the moment. I mean, it is a daft pronouncement. The simple fact is this. The residence test that we give in this country to workers coming here is to ensure that they have to spend a period of time here before they can claim benefits like JSA. That's because we have a means-tested system. In other European Union countries, people go there. Don't forget, Brits move to other parts of Europe all the time. I mean, after Poland and Italy, we're the third biggest workforce in the rest of Europe. When we go and work in their countries, they have a contributory system. So you actually cannot access benefits until you've contributed so much. So it's the same thing, but done in a different way. And that's been the case that the UK courts have upheld every time. I mean, it's one of the reasons why Europe needs to change. Leaving Europe, in the economic mess we're in at the moment, with a world that is increasingly dependent on regions to punch their way, I can think of nothing more self-destructive that we could do than to...
Would you like Labour to call for a... Would you like Labour to call for a referendum before the election so that the public can have their say and...
No, now is not the time to increase uncertainty in the British economy and for British business. You know, this is one of those...
It might increase certainty, mightn't it?
Well, you would have to have a debate, and you would be talking about...
Perish the thought.
And you would be talking about... well, what I'm saying is we should be concentrating on growth in our economy, getting young people back to work, recovering from a terrible economic rest, and having an in-out referendum on European Union. It would be would actually jeopardise all of that.
I don't know whether we're going to win or lose this. I mean, Alan thinks we might win it, and I hope we do. But I think there's a more central issue. The whole thrust of European history over the last few centuries has been driven by the desire for people to control the way they are governed. and to have their voice heard by their governors. And we have, in the EU, we've got ourselves into a situation where even if 100% of the population of this country don't want something or do want something, that doesn't mean it will happen. Now, I don't believe, I agree with Alan, I don't believe in leaving Europe. Now it seems a completely wrong time and very destabilising and all the rest of it. But I also believe that David Cameron's desire to renegotiate is very realistic. He sees it as a good thing, but he appreciates that the terms we're living in it under are no longer acceptable. But his instinct, and I think it a perfectly reasonable one, is first to see if they can be made acceptable, if they can be renegotiated so that we are content. We do feel we control our own government. We do feel we are a free country and not being driven this way and that. And it's only after the failure of that effort that we should even be having a conversation about whether we should stay in. That's what I think.
Very brief point. We're running out of time. You, sir, in the front row. Very briefly, please.
I think it's quite ghastly what we've heard today, but I do believe that the UK is right in this matter. The UK is particularly right in this matter, and I do agree with Alan Johnson, Anna Soubry in this case, that the UK has systems, has policies in place that shouldn't really be tampered with. And again, to leave the EU at this kind of time, it will be particularly destabilising to the markets. It's important that we remain for the prosperity of our nation.
Mehdi Hasan, do you think that it's an own goal for the Commission in the sense that it will...
It's definitely an own goal in terms of emboldening and empowering UKIP. I'm not sure the EU Commission looks at, how its policies affect the UK Independence Party before it makes them. Perhaps it should, for Britain's interests. In response to the question, and no, of course, we shouldn't pull out the EU if one legal decision goes against us, and whether it does or not, who knows, I'm not a lawyer. I just want to make two wider points on that subject very quickly. Number one is to echo what Alan said. There are 2 million Britons living, working, studying, retired in the EU who are able to access, 800,000 in Spain alone, who are able to access benefits based on contributory principles in those countries. It's not just one-way traffic. Don't believe all the hype you read in your newspapers this morning. It's a two-way road. And the second point is this. Please, one thing that hasn't been said, let's not use these decisions or these stories to scaremonger about the role that migrants play in our society, especially in relation to the benefit system. All of the academic studies show that migrants pay in more in tax than they take out in benefits. They're less likely to be on the benefit system. They're less likely to live in social housing than British-born people. They're less likely to be out of work.
I'm going to have to stop.
They're less likely to abuse the NHS. So I would ask UKIP, please stop demonising immigrants, whether Bulgarian or Romanian.
Anna Soubry, we're into injury time.
I know. Very quickly, I absolutely agree with the last comment. Alan is right in his analysis. This was a rule introduced in the 90s. It's been tested in the Supreme Court. Other countries support us. We have supported other countries. The Austrians,
says your
for
party
example.
Should stop. Andy Coulson says this week that your party should stop.
You're naughty because you're interrupting me, and I didn't interrupt you.
Sorry.
And I haven't got much time left now.
You haven't.
But he's right in his analysis. And I will say this: we need to renegotiate. We need to look at the way of doing things in the European Union better. I think there's a groundswell of opinion throughout the EU that's actually in agreement with us. And so I look forward to 2015, the return of a Conservative government. We will enter into all of that, and then we can have a referendum. I hope we vote to stay in the European Union, but we need to have that referendum so we can lance this boil once and for all.
Exactly.
Time's up. Apologies to those of you who wanted to get in on this. If we had an hour and a half, I'd bring you all in and we could keep going in cracking form, but our time is up. We can only do an hour. And we're going to be, just thinking ahead, in Blackburn next week. Douglas Alexander's going to be on the panel for Labour, and the writer, historian and Daily Mail columnist Ian Wilson will also be there. The week after that, we're going to be in Edinburgh. We have a completely different audience in Edinburgh. Watch out if you can think of coming to it. 16 and 17-year-olds only, because for the first time in the United Kingdom they're going to have a vote in the election, of course, for the referendum on independence. So in Edinburgh, 2 weeks from now, just 16 and 17-year-olds. So if you're under 18 in Edinburgh, and if you're any age in Blackburn, frankly, you're welcome to come. Apply via our website or call 0330 123 9988. My thanks to our panel here, to all of you who came. And remember, if you're listening, I hope you may have been on 5 Live. This carries on now in extra time on 5 Live. But from Question Time here in the studio in London, good night.